structured way, or we can do it in a chaotic way if Greece defaults, but it is very clear that Greece will never pay back this amount of debt.
Very briefly, Convener, I was going to ask about Greece, but you've introduced it yourself. I mean, Greece by no means is the biggest economy in Europe. It's a fairly small economy. Why is it having such a major impact, though, on the European situation? Is it because of that reason you've given there, that they just can't afford to service their own debt? But it's a small economy compared to Europe as a whole, so why is it such a significant problem?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, because I think it demonstrates very clearly how interdependent the European economies have become. That a small economy with 3% of the Eurozone GDP can threaten the whole economic and monetary union. But we simply did not have systems to deal with what happened in Greece. So what we were faced with when the crisis started was a situation where Greece was in essence threatening to go bankrupt. And if Greece had gone bankrupt then, I firmly believe the situation would have been a lot worse than it is now. The problem with Greece was that, for example, all the major large banks, especially in continental Europe, held large amounts of Greek debt. For a long time, it was seen as a very safe way of lending. Greece could borrow whatever it wanted on the open market. So if we had had a Greek default at the time, and you have to remember at the time we already had a banking crisis, so if we had added to that a default of Greece, it would have been a meltdown of the financial system. And even countries outside the Eurozone, which had never been that concerned with a country like Greece, but I mean, we had warnings, for example, from the US, which said we cannot risk this kind of meltdown at that point in time. So this kind of contagion, the way the problems in a country like Greece very quickly multiply through the Eurozone and beyond, I think is a clear demonstration of interdependence. So we are at the point where we have to find mechanisms where we can have the right governance for all the countries within the monetary union. Otherwise, it's not going to work in the long run.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Hanzala Malik.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. However, you've alluded to a number of issues, primarily about the UK's attitude to Europe currently. And that's an interesting theory, because the UK itself is going through a difficult time in terms of its own geographic boundaries and what may or may not happen in 2014 in terms of Scottish independence. And that also will have complications. So I think that we're going to have this issue fluttering around for a period of time, because if, for example, the UK did decide to pull out of the European Union, I think there'll probably be a meltdown of European Union as well, because the UK industry is far bigger and has a far bigger share in its involvement in Europe than Greece does. So I think there are very serious implications there, and I think it'll be unlikely that Britain would be allowed to pull out of Europe unilaterally. I think there'll be a lot at stake. But there's also another complication, and that is we have this theory that anybody that lives within Europe has the right to join the European Union. And you've got Turkey knocking at the door as a European nation as well. And although they have not succeeded in their first attempt to join the European Union, I think on the second time they may well be successful because of the huge economic benefit they would bring to Europe, because they have developed far more rapidly than most of our European counterparts have. So they would probably be an asset. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts, firstly, on the UK's membership and how that would affect Scotland, and also the possible application by Turkey to continue to want to join the European Union?
The impact of the UK leaving, I hope I didn't create the wrong impression. I think it would be a very negative thing, both for the UK and for the rest of Europe. I believe that the UK should be in the European Union. I think the UK has a lot to offer. But I think the other side of the coin is also that the UK is highly dependent economically, but also politically on the European Union. So I do believe the UK should be in the European Union. But the reason why it's in question is the question of how constructive and how willing is the UK to take part in what is happening at the moment. If there is a move in the UK, then the legal situation is that since the Lisbon Treaty, a country can leave the European Union. Beforehand, we didn't have that provision, but now there's an exit clause. So technically, the UK could simply announce that they leave, and there would be nothing which could be done. So in terms of being allowed to leave, and that makes it different from Greece, for example. Within the Economic and Monetary Union membership of the Euro, there's no exit clause. You cannot leave the Euro, but you can leave the EU. So there are big differences here. But certainly if that happened, it would have a negative effect on the EU. But my belief is it would have an even bigger negative effect on the UK. I think that in a situation where economies are struggling across the board, the last thing you need is economic disintegration. That is, for me, that makes no sense whatsoever. But the reality is, politically, if it happens, the EU would have to accept it. Where Turkey is concerned, it's a difficult question. Turkey has been a candidate for a long time now, and we are not seeing a lot of progress because in some countries there is still a strong opposition to Turkey joining the European Union on cultural grounds, on political grounds, on economic grounds. What we are also seeing is that the attitude in Turkey is changing. Turkey is becoming much more of a regional power, much more confident in itself, much clearer about its important strategic role in the region it is in. I think it is a real pity that we are not making progress. I would certainly say that Turkey would be a useful addition to the European Union. Yes, with conditionality attached. There have to be certain rules which need to be followed, but the willingness has to be there. My view is we should be setting a realistic target date for Turkey and set out very clearly what Turkey still needs to do to reach that target date. But what we're doing at the moment is, in essence, postponing the accession process indefinitely because of the opposition of individual member states. And that's not a good message. And it also means that the European Union as a whole is losing influence in the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Helen Eady.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning as well, and thank you for being here this morning. We see much of the word austerity right across Europe, and that's a word that we're very familiar with here under David Cameron's Prime Ministership in the UK as well. And that has meant that we've seen in Europe as well the huge strikes that have taken place just yesterday, and even indeed at the EU, we watched that officials of the EU walked out in strike too. And there has been a belief that if we have these austerity measures and cut back on public expenditure, that will allow people to get back to a degree of acceptable performance. But that has also been predicated on the belief that the private sector rather would help with the growth in the countries. Now, if you take all of that, we see that the private sector is just not delivering, certainly not in the UK. We're not getting the level of growth that we need, and I think it's probably true across the rest of Europe as well. But our eyes are also on what's going to happen in the USA with President Obama and the tax cuts that are going to perhaps take place if he can't get the right measures taken by January. And so I think that it's like the perfect storm that's brewing as well. So it's not just what's happening in Europe, it's what's happening in China and the USA as well. So I'm just wondering, do you really believe that the austerity measures are the answer? Because, the private sector is just not delivering either, and each has a dependence on the other.
It's difficult because I think there are a lot of different measures which are grouped into this term austerity measures. I think if we look at public finance consolidation, certainly there was and is a need for public finance consolidation in a number of countries, if not all countries, given the long-term trajectory. Public finance consolidation does not necessarily mean the same as austerity measures. I think that, for example, what we have seen is a lot of emphasis on cutting spending, much less emphasis on increasing taxes. So there's a big question of how exactly you consolidate your public finances. But it is also the case that there are a number of structural reform measures which have been called austerity measures. Many of these are not austerity measures. Many of these are about changing labor market, trying to tackle, for example, protected professions, which is still a big issue in a number of countries, trying to open up the markets in some areas. So there are a lot of different measures. But if we're talking about the crude cutting of public expenditure, then it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for the crisis countries because they've gone in a downward spiral where in essence, the current situation means lower growth means lower revenues, and lower revenues then means bigger deficits. So we've actually seen that the deficits in a number of the crisis countries has been increasing, not decreasing, because they cannot get out of this spiral by themselves. The question is how we best address it, and I think what we haven't got, and that's why I was emphasizing in my opening statement, the growth measures. We really need to provide positive measures, positive impulses to these economies as well, especially since we are seeing an even more worrying international environment where it is unlikely that a lot of positive growth impulses are going to come from the international economy. So we need to do more to help these countries. We've also, from the start, advocated that we need to ensure that we maintain some form of medium-term, long-term positive perspective. I mean, it is very clear that there will be a lot of economic suffering in these countries, and quite often when you read the media in Northern Europe, it glosses over the fact that life is incredibly hard for people on the ground in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, people who haven't got a job, who can no longer pay their rent. I mean, if we see social indicators, things like young people moving back into their parents' house because they can simply no longer afford an apartment. I mean, these are the kind of things which we're seeing all over the place. I think we need to give these countries some hope for the future. Yes, maybe there needs to be pain in the short term, But when you're starting to cut all those things which are important for long-term growth, such as education, such as infrastructure investment, such as investment in innovation, then we are going to have a long-term problem as well.
If I may, Convener, just to come back on that and say that I suppose the implications there are for democracy, because in some of those instances of the countries we're talking about, we've got technocrats in position rather than democrats in position, and that really is an issue. And I just wonder if you'd like to comment on that as well. But my final question to you this morning would be, we're seeing arising from the treaties that countries new member states must join the European Union. We see that Latvia has got a date of 2014 that it must join by then, and we also see that Romania must join the Euro by 2014 as well. I'm just wondering, are these on track, and do you think they'll go ahead given what's happening in the other parts of Europe? And I believe that Bulgaria must join as well, but it doesn't have a date set as yet.
I think in terms of Euro membership, it is a little bit confusing because there is a provision that any member of the European Union which does not have a formal opt-out is committed to joining the Euro at some point. This is and the only two formal opt-outs we have are Denmark and the UK. However, to actually join the Euro, you have to fulfill a number of conditions. And unless those conditions are fulfilled, you cannot join the Euro. So there's an assessment made of all the countries which are not in the Euro with regard to whether they are ready to join the Euro. If you do not want to join the Euro, then you can fail that assessment. And it is very easy to fail because one of the provisions is about being in the exchange rate mechanism, which is entirely voluntary. There's no way of forcing a country to join the exchange rate mechanism, and you have to have your currency stable in the exchange rate mechanism for at least 2 years. So what we've seen in the past is that countries like Sweden just simply are not part of the exchange rate mechanism, so they cannot be forced to introduce the euro. So no country in the European Union can be forced to introduce the euro. Now, a number of countries have said that they want to introduce the euro. Despite all the problems, the euro is still quite an attractive proposition for a number of countries. So the question for them is going to be, whatever the date which is being set is, will they fulfill the conditions? And frankly, at the moment, it looks very, very difficult for any country to fulfill the conditions because they are quite strict. So I wouldn't expect to see any enlargement of the Eurozone in the near future. I think it's unlikely. We shall see. I mean, obviously, there's still time for some of the criteria to be fulfilled, but it is a very big ask at the moment. And we've seen, I mean, the only country which got in recently, Estonia, had a very, very special economic position. And even they were in some areas quite close to the criteria. So for other countries to fulfill them at the moment, I think is going to be unlikely. I do not see, I mean, certainly not Romania and Bulgaria for the foreseeable future.
Just come back and ask, how does that sit with the requirements of the treaty, given that the treaty says that any new countries joining the EU must join? So you've got, a rule pointing one way, and you're saying there are other rules pointing the other way?
The treaty says you must commit to joining the euro eventually when you fulfill the conditions. So if you don't fulfill the conditions, then you don't join the euro.
A couple other people come in. If I've got time at the end, Helen, I can let you back in, but I've got 3 other members wanting to get in, and we're quickly running out of time. I've got Claire, Rod and Chick next, so if Claire wants to...
2 very, very quick questions. Professor Zillig, I was at the the Scotland Europa Conference, which you were a member of the panel at during the summer, and we did talk at length about the UK's relationship following the use of the veto. And I just would like an opinion of what impact the recent vote at Westminster, where they voted not to increase the European budget, will have on the MAF negotiations and the budget setting for and how the UK is viewed, having had that decision taken in Westminster. And secondly, when you were talking about the collateralisation of the debt, you used the phrase "we're all exposed to that risk." Could you just maybe explain how the UK sits in that "we"? Thank you.
I think the vote in the House of Commons on the multi-annual financial framework has made the situation even more complicated. While it is a non-binding vote, it clearly sets the tone for what the UK government is asking for in Brussels. There is, and this is undoubtedly the case, there's of course a certain political consideration of a number of countries that it's quite good to have the UK ask for these cuts because they want the cuts as well. But it's much easier to say, well, it's the UK, it's not us, and we just have to go along with it. So, I mean, this is part of the normal negotiation process. But if this vote in the House of Commons means that the UK is no longer willing to compromise, then we have a problem. And that's, I think, what we are facing at the moment. It is... I think the worrying sign is that it's no longer clear whether the UK really has the ability to get a compromise through the House of Commons. And if that's not the case, then we are at the veto stage again. Sorry, what was the other?
It was in relation to the collateralisation of the debt, the risk.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a direct risk for the countries which are part of the Economic and Monetary Union through the European Central Bank. But I think the overall situation is still that we have a financial system which is fragile. And if we have any major problems in the banking system, it would quickly spread from the Economic and Monetary Union to the rest of Europe, and I think it would trigger a global crisis. So the risks which are there are still very real. But there are, of course, risks also when you take on the responsibilities. The biggest concern of countries like Germany is that if you collateralize the debt without having the political, the economic integration alongside, then it would create moral hazard. So the fear is that countries would then continue with unsustainable borrowing because they would know that the European level would step in. So this is the reason why we cannot have a collateralization of debt without the political and the economic integration at the same time.
Thanks very much. Claire, Rod.
Morning, Dr. Zulig. I'd be grateful if you could perhaps put a bit more flesh on your comments that it's not feasible to have a multi-speed Europe, in particular comments in relation to banking union affecting the single market. Do you not think that poses particular difficulties for the United Kingdom government, given its current view? And is it ever likely to be the case that the UK will embrace a multi-speed Europe?
I mean, the reality at the moment is
Is it ever the case that the UK will embrace a kind of one-speed Europe, not multi-speed? Sorry about that.
I think it's it's important to note that what we have at the moment is a multi-speed Europe. So I'm not saying that this is an impossibility in a number of areas. We clearly have different speeds, different arrangements. If you look at something like the Schengen Agreement, it's very clearly some countries are part, some other countries are not part. And I don't think that these kind of areas we would have a problem going forward. But when it comes to the economic integration part, then when we look at what does a full economic union mean, a full economic union is clearly linked to the single market. We are talking about taxation, we're talking about public spending, we're talking about banking regulation, supervision. These are all parts of the single market. We're talking about mobility of capital, mobility of people. All of this will be affected by the integration process which is there. So while we have maintained what I would say is a fiction at the European level, whenever we've put these things into place, we've said in the first paragraph, whatever happens, it should not affect the single market. I don't think this is in the long run possible to maintain. Of course it will affect the single market if there's a different supervisor for banks in the Eurozone than outside the Eurozone. That has to have an effect on the single market. What that means for the UK, I think, is the big long-term question. Is the UK willing to be part of it? I don't know. But I certainly don't think that there can be a pick and choose. I think what we are seeing at the moment is an emphasis that, for example, the UK would retain a veto on all financial sector regulation. I think in the long run it cannot be maintained. We have to have a situation where we can effectively make rules at the European level to govern banks, and that cannot happen if we give one country a veto on everything which happens.
Can I just ask another question? What's your best guess as to where Europe will be in 12 months' time? Where will this crisis be in 12 months' time? Your best guess?
I think pretty much where we are now. I think the immediate crisis is not going to go away, but we are also not going to get as close to the wire as we have in the last couple of years. So what one of my colleagues has called muddling through. We will continue to muddle through. The big question for me will be whether we are on the right trajectory for the more long-term resolution. The question of what kind of integration steps, what kind of political integration will come next, that's a big question. And this is, we don't know at the moment exactly where we are going to go. But I think there has to be something ambitious on the table. We have to be able to see at least what the goal is. It will take quite some time to put all this into place. It will not all happen at the same time. If we're talking about significant additional integration steps, it will take years. There's no question the European system has moved very quickly in the crisis, but for fundamental issues like a political union, we're talking about treaty change, we're talking about a convent at the European level, we're talking about a number of years. So we're not talking about something which will be resolved very quickly, but I think we at least should be able to see what the trajectory is.
So from Scotland's point of view, with a referendum coming up in 2014, a little bit more clarity, but not much.
Probably, yes.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much. Rod Chick Brodie.
Thank you for allowing me to do this. I want to go back to, you talking about the conditions. You talked about the need for enforcing public finance discipline. The conditions for the ERM had certain limitations in terms of budget deficits and that debt should be no greater than 60% of the GDP. That, of course, there have been many holes shot in that, clearly with Greece, for example, at 200%. and some countries like Italy being allowed to join the ERM without achieving these targets. The difficulty, I think you may have answered part of it in the last question. We have a situation where Germany is effectively buying back its own debt in Greece, not just Germany. We have the UK, whether it likes it or not, strapped because the French banks have got a large share in the Greece debt, and RBS has 40%, is a 40% creditor to the French banks. So whether we like it or not, the UK is facing that situation. These and creditor nations like China are unhappy to write off their debts. Germany and the other European countries need a market, albeit small, to sustain that market for the goods. How do you see this political union, which will be required to effect the fiscal union, being achieved?
I think a lot already has changed. It is true that in the past we've had the Stability and Growth Pact, which was supposed to guarantee the kind of public finance discipline which very obviously wasn't the case. One of the reasons why the Stability and Growth Pact didn't work was very simply that Germany and France ignored it when it didn't suit them, and it changed the political game. Afterwards, to ask countries like Greece to respect something which Germany and France clearly don't respect becomes politically impossible. But there have been a lot of changes, and I wouldn't underestimate the impact these changes are having. I always say to reporters, well, yes, there's a problem with moral hazard, but if you look at the situation in Greece, who would want to be the Greek government at the moment? Who would want to be in that situation where you are at the point where you can make no independent decisions anymore, where you're struggling to get a coalition together to just go from week to week, and where you're fundamentally unpopular with your own electorate? Who would want to be Greece? Who would want to be the government in other countries as well? So things have changed. We also are in a situation where countries no longer get away with things. The scrutiny countries are under is far greater than it ever was at the European level. A country which does not fulfill its obligations in terms of public finances will be publicly discussed. They will have to justify themselves in front of their peers. This is a big change. We are interfering quite a lot at the European level in what happens with national public finances.
Forgive me, we're not just talking about Greece, are we? We're talking about Spain, Portugal, Italy. I mean, and presumably it comes down to the end of the day, who's going to drive the political union? But I wonder if I can just if I may, just one other question. Scotland is about, I think rightly, if we look at the views of senior international economists in using capital investment as a basis for trying to secure economic growth. Wouldn't it be better to have something like the Marshall Plan that would, it's not exactly the same situation clearly, but the Marshall Plan that was invoked by the Americans, particularly in terms of supporting the European economy after the Second World War? Wouldn't it be something better like that to generate capital investment and come up with some agreement with the individual countries that a program of investing in capital and infrastructure would be a better way, rather than just simply putting money into countries, as I say, to buy back debt?
I mean, just on the point about other countries as well, I emphasize Greece because it's a particular case. But even when we look at the changes in other countries, I mean, Berlusconi, in essence, lost his job because he could no longer credibly interact with the European partners. It wasn't the Italian system which kicked him out; it was the European system. So politically, a lot has changed already. But in terms of should we have a Marshall Plan, well, We called it a New Deal, but it's the same idea. Yes, we need something where we invest in especially the crisis countries to help them to grow in the future, be it infrastructure, be it the education system, be it in terms of creating the cross-border large networks which we need for the single market to work properly. There are some moves in that direction, but what is there at the moment is far too small. But maybe, we don't know yet, but there's a lot of discussion at the moment around a fiscal capacity, which is in essence a Eurozone budget. Maybe some of the idea behind that is exactly to go in that direction. But certainly, at the moment, if we are not going to do something decisive to help these countries to grow, then we are going to very quickly get to the point where the whole process becomes politically infeasible.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're just right on our time. Can I thank you, Dr. Zulig, for your evidence to the committee. I think we have found it extremely helpful and extremely informative, and we thank you for that, and hopefully we will, in a future time, welcome you back to committee. Thank you very much. Thank you. Members, I'm going to have a very quick 5-minute comfort break, so if you can be back in your seats for 10:10. Okay, welcome back, and moving on to agenda item 3 is our Brussels Bulletin, very ably put together by Dr Ian Duncan. I think we'll just ask Ian to speak to the Brussels Bulletin and take comments from members after Ian's presentation. Ian.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just want to touch upon, I think, 3 broad areas this morning. You'll notice all the substantive points in the bulletin this time are about economics, finance, and the Eurozone situation. Again, as Dr. Sulik said just a few moments ago, you have to read the papers almost every day to keep abreast of these things. A couple of things to note. The Greek Parliament has now passed its austerity budget, and I just draw your attention to the bullet points in the note, just to let you see what the people of Greece are up against. And it is quite a severe suite of conditions, including retirement age, pension cuts, salary cuts across the board, minimum wage cuts, holiday benefit cuts, severance pay cuts. It goes on. And despite having passed this, the Eurozone ministers have not yet been able to agree to unlock the next tranche of money. So it should happen at the next European Council, which is next week, but it hasn't happened yet. And it's a reminder again of what is being asked and what is being expected from the people of Greece right now. Touching again on the multi-annual financial framework, I think something happened last Friday which was quite telling. Discussions about the annual budget for next year broke down in acrimony. This is a discussion about only 12 months' worth. The Parliament and the Council were unable to reach agreement because of a 9 billion shortfall. That's how much is missing, if you like, from the commitments which the EU has made and what the budget would actually pay for. And over 9 billion, the talks collapsed. Now, if that continues, it will roll over. And I know, Claire, we were talking about this at the last meeting. They will just roll over month by month. But it's a reminder again of what exactly the Member States and the Parliament are up against when it comes to the multi-annual financial framework, where it's considerably more than 9 billion which will be at issue. So that will be something to note. And again, there's some comments in here about where things are on that particular budget. There is an ambition from the Cypriots to try and bring some sort of conclusion to the early stage over the figures, and they have not been successful thus far. They are looking to try and see a rise in the budget of around about 4.8%, but you'll know from reading the papers and following the news that many other people would like that to be higher. And the Parliament, which has a much stronger role in the budget this time around, is very much unwilling to sacrifice anything. And in lots of ways, the elected members inside the European Parliament are stating very clearly, you, the Council, have made these commitments. You have said this is what you wish to do. You can't make the commitments unless you're willing to fund the commitments, otherwise it seems a bit silly. So they're being, if you like, the custodians of propriety in this, and the Member States, as you'll see from some other comments here, are seeking to cut and to trim wherever they can. And one of the issues which I know a predecessor of the convener, Irene Oldfather, was very much excited by at the time was the Globalisation Adjustment Fund. And some of the contributing Member States now wish to eliminate it entirely. And this was at the time seemed to be one of the most important measures to support countries going through the job losses that result from globalisation. And Member States are seriously considering eliminating it, not just trimming it, not just cutting it, but getting rid of it. And that should be, again, a reminder of what the budget talks will be about. It will no longer be about just cutting little bits around the edges. It will be about big heart issues which will have to be examined. Final point again, just on the gender equality issue which we touched on last week. An interesting development, the Spanish have blocked the appointment of a member of the European Central Bank's board because he is a man. They have said that there should be gender equality in this issue, supporting the Parliament's view, which has already been expressed. Whether that will stand remains to be seen, because Member States acting in Council can still push this through, but it's a reminder again that there are issues playing through where interesting things can still happen.
Okay, comments, questions? Helen?
Yes, I was especially interested when I was reading this section about the tourism initiative that's at the back of the brochure. They're talking about consultation and communication activities with the travel trade and consumers. Do you have any idea how that would be done in the context of Scotland? I mean, will Scotland have a chance to comment on that and be consulted?
Absolutely, I would have thought so. there's a recognition now that Europe can actually sell itself as a tourist destination because it's got a lot to sell. So what is happening just now is the Commissioner trying to encourage member states and regions of member states to contribute to this, to try and establish exactly what it is they're trying to sell and how best they can sell it. So yes, absolutely, Scotland will have a chance.
Right, isn't that then?
Okay. Well, Claire?
Just a supplementary on Helen's. In terms of the Schengen Agreement, obviously there's visa implications for in promoting the countries, and obviously there's increased costs in the UK. So how will this promoting of Europe as a whole, how will they handle that within that?
I'm almost tempted to say they haven't thought about that. I don't mean that badly, but I mean that the people who put forward the tourism ideas are not the people who deal with the Schengen area. So it may well, that sounds a terrible answer, doesn't it? But it may well be something almost as simple as that. There clearly are implications about visas and so forth. I don't doubt that they will have to address those if they're going to market an EU-wide offering when there are other issues around passports. But no, you're right.
Molly Coffey?
Thanks. Could I just come back to the Greek issue there that you mentioned there? You really have to be sympathetic, I think, to the plight of the ordinary people in Greece and the measures that they're facing. None of this is their fault or their doing. We heard from Dr. Zulig a moment ago saying that there has to be a dual approach. I think it might be fair to summarise what he was saying. There has to be a dual approach here. Yes, to try to reduce national debt, but yes, to allow the countries to invest, to have some investment in the countries to allow them to recover. The measures being imposed in Greece seem to be, on the face of it, putting the country in even more difficulty and giving it more difficulties in terms of its ability to recover. Ian, is there any flip side of what's happening to Greece to actually carry out what Dr. Zulig was actually suggesting is needed in these countries to try and give them an opportunity to recover and invest, particularly capital investment and so on? Is that happening in Greece, or is it all cuts?
The only thing which has happened is there has been a broad agreement now to postpone the dates of the fiscal targets by 2 years. So if you like, to give Greece a longer period in which to meet its targets. I'm not entirely sure that it's a bit like being told you're going to lose a leg and then discovering it's only from the knee down. I'm not sure that's necessarily a great thing they're being offered, but it is small respite from the payment situation. The issue which will come to the fore is forgiveness. At what point will the debts be forgiven, and what would that look like? Because without the forgiveness, then it will all be austerity, and it isn't obvious where the funding for anything else will come. From the EU side of things, there will be attempts to use various funds in the next financial round to invest in Greece, but a lot of those can only be unlocked with matching funds. So there will have to be conditions which are adjusted in order to allow Greece to do that. So I'm thinking again of structural funds, cohesion policy, where a lot of these things are actually about co-financing. With what? How do you co-finance if you have got no money? So I think the EU can still do more to address some of these issues if there is an appetite to do so. But at the moment, all focus is upon getting Greece to sign up to its commitments, and there is very little appetite to allow them a great deal of slack around that.
Okay.
John Campbell.
Something that's not actually in the bulletin, but just the impact of kind of the budget on the Erasmus student exchange programme. Whether we might want to flag that up in a future bulletin or whatever. But
well, you're right. The 9 billion shortfall is primarily made up of the Erasmus project itself. Without the 9 billion, it can't go ahead in its present form at all. And given its nature, it's very hard to see how it could go forward in any form without, because you can't take a little bit out of the Erasmus thing and expect it still to work. It has to be supported with the funds. Yes, a future bulletin can report on that and the implications for that. At the moment, were the issue to roll forward month by month, then Erasmus would continue to receive the monies as it does at the moment. That's not exactly the best way of taking forward an issue which is to support exchange, given its nature. I think the best thing for me to do is to report on that in the future with more information.
Okay, just if I can come in quickly and I'll let you in a sec, Helen.
Thanks very much. So used to us asking questions that are not in the bulletin. This is following from last month's question, that is to do with regional state aid, regional selective assistance, and it's really to find out if you're aware of any update at all in that.
My plan on that, I'm in Brussels next week, and I've got a couple of meetings set up to inquire into that, so I will report back at the meeting of the 29th on what I find out then.
Okay, a couple other things for me, Ian, is the same impact on Erasmus could possibly be on Horizon 2020, maybe your thoughts on that. And the other thing is, in Westminster last week, when they had the vote on the EU budget, the proposal from the UK government was to freeze the overall budget but to reduce the cap budget. And I wonder if maybe for a future meeting you could have a look at that and the impact that would have on Scotland's farmers, because I think it has a greater impact on Scotland's farmers than it does in a wider UK sense.
Yes, I think what would be best for me to do is to bring forward a paper covering all the aspects of the multi-annual financial framework, because at the moment the UK has put forward a position with regards to a reduction in cap, but clearly other countries have sought reductions in other major sources of money. For example, as we've discussed before, the French would like to reduce cohesion funding significantly. Every country seems to be trying to reduce the pots of money it doesn't get a lot from. But you're quite right to highlight the fact that Scotland qualifies under a number of other areas within the overarching common agricultural policy, particularly the less favoured area status, which brings a significant amount of money both to Scotland and to Wales, but less so to England because of its nature. So I think rather than be trying to piecemeal answer that, I think a short paper that outlines where the different countries are and their key negotiating positions, and that will become very clear, because there's just a wee note in here talking about confessionals, which is this slightly unusual term for the President of the Council asking member states, heads of member states, what are your red lines for the negotiations coming up? And so at that point, I think we'll be in a position to know very clearly exactly who wants to protect what and at what level. So yes, there's absolutely no doubt about that. And in terms of the Horizon 2020, we're still in the last tranche, of course, of the predecessor, the FP7 policy, and that will have implications for that, because there is still some money left to be spent. It remains to be seen exactly how they will manage to resolve this issue, given that the Parliament are unwilling to negotiate at all. They wish the money to be paid. They don't wish to try and negotiate around the money. They see that 9 billion as the minimum they can accept in this particular round. It's difficult to see how a compromise can emerge in the short term, particularly when the MAF talks are meant to be beginning, well, or be much clearer by the end of the year.
Okay, I think our colleagues in the Rural Committee would welcome being kept up to date with the cap. So anything that you do for us, if we're happy to share that with our colleagues in the Rural Committee. Yeah, okay, any final questions for Ian? Can we move on? No? Okay, thank you very much. Agenda item 4 is a report on Scottish Government's transposition of EU directives, which is something we are taking quite a keen interest in on the committee thus far. This is a regular report to provide the latest information, and I think, are you going to say something on that, Ian?
Just very briefly, you'll recall again that we look at this on a 6-monthly basis. Hans-Ala, you've spoken about doing this more frequently, and that's something we're going to be able to explore after the next one. At the moment, there are no major things to highlight to this committee in terms of deadlines being missed or anything. That it's traditional then for this committee to refer on to the subject committees, who are then able to take forward any specific issues they wish with their minister. So I would recommend referral onward if the committee are content with that.
Okay, you'll see from the paper that there's a recommendation to note the government's transposition report and to forward the report to relevant subcommittees as the relevant subject committee. Committee agreed to do that. Yeah, Willie, okay.
Can I just ask, again, as a relatively new member of the committee, my attention was drawn to the tables there, and it mentions the Glasgow Commonwealth Games Act ticket touting offences, exemption for use of the internet in Scotland, regulations and so on. I just wondered, what's this all about, and do we have an interest in this particular issue? For a long time, as you're probably aware, convener, buying tickets for any events, it can be a bit of a precarious experience, particularly when ticket agencies and companies can somehow seem to grab a huge lion's share of tickets for all sorts of events, and I would hope that that wouldn't be the case when it comes to the Commonwealth Games, where people trying to buy tickets for events online, like at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, can't get near them because ticket agencies have got all the tickets. That to me is a form of online ticket touting, and I just wonder, Convener, is that within the scope of our consideration here? And is there anything we can do about it or say about it?
I'll take some advice from you on that one, Ian.
Well, you're right to highlight that point, first of all. Yes, that issue would be, I suspect, covered within this. I had a look at the particular Act itself. What I would suggest is that we frame the point you've raised there, and in passing this on to the appropriate committee, we ask them to be particularly cognizant of that aspect of it so they can inquire further. This committee, of course, is welcome to inquire into any aspect of this, but it may well be that the lead committee would be the first port of call, and I would ask them in taking it forward to keep both this committee and you, Willie, of course, in the loop on their findings.
Well, what committee would it be?
I think this one would actually go to the, well, there are two places to look at it. I think it would actually be the Economy Committee, primarily, but I think that the Health and Sport Committee would be copied in simply by the nature of the issue. But no, it would be the Economy Committee.
Do you have that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Happy to pass this on to subject committees then? Thank you very much. Okay, and moving on to agenda item 5, which is to consider correspondence from Patricia Ferguson MP, MSP, giving you a different title, sorry Patricia. Can I welcome you to the committee this morning? Before I do go on, it is worth noting the committee has already agreed to revisit the issue of Scotland's relation with the EU upon publication of the Scottish Government's White Paper on constitutional arrangements. With that in mind, it would be useful if members could focus only upon Patricia Ferguson's proposal that this committee should undertake an inquiry into the Scottish Government's handling of the issues of legal advice on Scotland's relations with the EU post-referendum. I propose to ask Patricia Ferguson to speak to the request in her letter. It's already been circulated to members. You should have it in your papers. And thereafter, I will take soundings from every member on the committee to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to comment. Could I call on Patricia first to speak to her letter? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener, and don't worry, I've been called a lot worse. But I am very grateful for the opportunity to come along this morning and to talk about what I think is a very important issue that has arisen. And I should say firstly that I recognise the keen interest that this committee has in all matters European, and I watch the proceedings of this committee with some interest, having been a relatively long-serving member of the committee in the past. I say that because I joined in June, was off for the months of September and October through ill health, came back in early November to find myself the longest serving member on the committee. So things can change very, very quickly, as we know. But on the substance of the letter I sent, and I do understand that the committee had decided that it would look again at the whole issue of the EU membership once the white paper was published. But actually one of the points of my letter was to ask the committee to revisit that decision and to consider looking into that issue now. There is a great deal of debate raging in Scotland around this issue. The conclusion that the Scottish Government comes to in a year's time will mean that there is actually a very short timetable available to the Parliament for the scrutiny of the many matters that will be raised by the White Paper. You only have to look at the parliamentary timetable to see how tight a white paper being published a year prior to the actual referendum taking place would be. So I think it's actually an issue that I would want to encourage the committee to consider at an earlier point, because many of the matters relating to whether or not Scotland would be an automatic member of the EU, and if so, what conditions would apply, are the kinds of things that actually will help to influence people's decisions when they come to the ballot box in 2014. And I think it is, if I may say so, incumbent on this committee to help to try and provide some clarity, if not on what the final position would be, because there are very many views on that, but at least to help to frame the debate. And as I say, I would hope that the committee would reconsider that part of its previous decision. With regard to the first part of my letter about the way in which this discussion has so far been handled in Parliament, I'm acutely conscious, and I thought about it long and hard, before I brought it to the committee, but I was acutely conscious that the Parliament really doesn't have a mechanism at the moment for looking at matters such as this, which may arise, hopefully not often, hopefully not at all, but may arise from time to time. And it seemed to me that given that the situation around the conflicting statements that have been made was so firmly embedded in the whole issue of Scotland's membership of the EU, that this, as the subject committee with most interest in that area, should be the place where an inquiry took place into the facts of that particular matter. I realise that the First Minister has referred himself to, or for consideration of, the points made with the ministerial code. However, I would point out that nowhere in the structure of things does the Parliament have an opportunity to consider that particular matter. And I think, as a point of principle, it should rest firmly with the Parliament. And in those situations, I think it should rest firmly, in this instance, with this committee.
Okay, thanks for that. Just very quickly, I'm looking at your letter and I don't see anywhere where you've asked the committee to revisit the decision of putting the inquiry into with the white paper. I don't see anywhere in the letter where you've made that request.
I certainly don't use the words revisit the decision, but I have made the point that there is a great deal of uncertainty around the issue of the EU, and I have asked the committee if they would seek to have an inquiry, and I think that is the point that I am making.
Okay, I'm going to go round the table, and I'll start with Rod first and just allow everyone to have their thoughts aired on this one.
A few comments. Firstly, I thought it was inappropriate to summarise Mr Salmon's response in 3 words when that's clearly not the response that was given. So I think that's a distortion. I found it difficult to follow the letter because it jumped around in 2 issues and therefore didn't make a lot of sense. As to the question of the timetable, I'd obviously be grateful for guidance from the convener and the clerk as to how much time has been allocated, but I think it's essential that we do allocate appropriate time. I also think we are in difficult waters in straying into matters of standards. I don't think that's really for this committee. It's for other committees possibly to consider standards generally. And I am concerned about the bringing the Lord Advocate into the political arena. The Lord Advocate has not been a member of the Cabinet of the Scottish Government since 2007. We've moved towards having the Lord Advocate kept out of politics, whatever the activities of the Advocate General in Westminster. And I think it would be a retrograde step if we were to try and vary that position.
Okay, Helen Eadie.
Thank you very much, Convener. I support Patricia Ferguson in this, and the reason that I do so is very clear. I do believe that right across Scotland, one of the most important, vitally important issues that faces our nation is actually in knowing what the answers are to the key questions about whether or not we would continue to have membership automatically. The First Minister has not been able to give us a categorical assurance on that. He has not even, as far as I know, had any discussions with or letters or correspondence with the European Commission on the matter. An inquiry would help to bring that out. If the First Minister has not already done so, it would mean that before preparing his bill, he would then be in a position to know absolutely with certainty what the position is as regards the other European Union member states. Because as we know, we've heard opinion and speculation right across the newspapers, the media, as to what the situation would be with regards to the reaction of other member states were they asked about the Scotland's position should it choose to become independent, whether or not, first of all, the point is, would the people of Scotland wish to join the EU? Would there be a referendum about EU membership? Following on from this, there are many questions that need to be asked, and that's why I feel that it really is important that this inquiry isn't just, looking at, issues of blame or where the blame lies for what has happened. What's much more important is the road ahead. My grandchildren, my children need to be certain of their futures. We need to know what the position will be across our pensions, across our jobs, across the legal systems. Would we be tied in to the European concept? I am a very pro-European person, someone who would campaign for a yes vote should there be a referendum. We've heard Greenland has been quoted by the First Minister in the past. Greenland actually had a referendum about whether or not it would join the EU. So does the First Minister want to agree to take us down that road? And we say today about timescales. Now, if the white paper is not published till the middle of next year, we don't have a precise date as yet, as far as I'm aware. You may know differently, but my own supposition is that this is going to be in the autumn of next year. That means that this committee would have relatively little time to be able to inform the wider public. We would become informed as a committee in the process of the bill going through the Parliament, but in terms of the wider public, then being able to have the message cascaded out to them as to what the questions are and the answers are, then that would be a problem. And that's why the sooner we undertake this work, the better, because I think it would be a very major piece of work. And my a further point would be that in terms of the committee being relevant to do this, I would propose today that if the committee does not agree that it's got the time to do this work, I believe it's so important we should make the time. But if the committee is saying that we aren't going to make the time, which would be against my will, I would propose that this be referred on a motion from me to the Parliamentary Bureau, because the Parliamentary Bureau would need to look at all the other aspects of all the other committees that are relevant to the work that is involved in Scotland. Of all the other interests, there would be the Economy Committee, there would be the Finance Committee, there would be the Tourism Committee, the Transport Committee. All these committees have got a relevant stake in what happens in whether or not we have European Union membership automatically. So I would propose formally, and I hope I will get a seconder for that, that this be referred to the Parliamentary Bureau if the committee does not agree to undertake this work today.
Claire Adamson.
If I could look at this in 2 points. In the first paragraph on the second page, Patricia Ferguson does discuss areas of the EU and raises questions about euro currency and the Schengen Agreement. And I would agree that all of those areas are the areas in which are likely to be discussed in the work programme as agreed when the white paper is published, and I absolutely believe that that's the right paper to do this. I'm a bit confused now as to Helen says this inquiry, but it's the following paragraph that actually asks about inquiry, but it says, into this whole sorry debacle to find out the truth about who knew what when. That's not about European issues, that's about standards issues and about what happened. In terms of what that says there, this seems to hang about the position of the First Minister, which was a position taken by Miss Ferguson herself in 2003 when she answered a parliamentary question by saying it's a long-standing convention. The general policy of the Scottish Executive is that it does not disclose legal advice or whether it has taken legal advice. There's also I think time has moved on since this letter was done, and we've had the evidence given by the Lord Advocate last week in answer to questions to the Lord Advocate, and he has said that it's possible that a court would rule that this Parliament do not have the power to hold a referendum, in which case this would be academic. Following the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement, there will be a lawful referendum, so that uncertainty has been removed. So following the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement and the oncoming publication of the white paper, I think the timing for actually looking at these issues is absolutely fine. So I do not support either the request for a move in the timescale for looking at the European issues, and I certainly do not support or believe that this committee is the one who should be looking at the other areas.
Okay, thank you. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to Ms Ferguson. Thanks for joining the committee. I'm just looking at your letter and looking at some of the content there. And I would say to you, it's a pity that you weren't in for the previous session with Fabian Zulig from the European Policy Centre, where he was asked by your colleague about Scotland's position in relation to the euro. And that's one of the questions you pose in your letter. Would a separate Scotland be forced to join the euro currency? His response to the question was quite clear that Scotland would not be forced to join euro currency. No country can be forced to join the euro currency. In fact, a country would be expected to meet certain criteria and convergence criteria and so on. And there are some examples of countries not being part of the euro, the UK being one. And I think it was Gordon Brown that put in place the 4 convergence criteria for the UK to avoid joining the euro. So he didn't see it as a huge issue, but he certainly did dismiss the notion that a country could be forced to do something that they didn't want to. So in that sense, the question that you posed to the committee in your letter's been answered, even in the previous session that we had a moment ago by Dr. Zulig. And like my other colleagues, I don't really see the need for an inquiry before the Scottish Government publishes its proposals. And I think at that point, it really is an opportunity for the committee to engage with the issues when we're obviously a bit clearer about what the Scottish Government's position actually is.
Okay, Hans Alan Malik.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to welcome Patricia to our meeting today. Thank you for joining us, and I see your correspondence, and the best way I can describe it, it's about an impression of opinion that you've put in front of us. And I'm also, I agreed with Helen Eadie last time as well in terms of we should be actually looking into this issue, and I haven't changed my mind. I still agree with Helen Eadie in terms of we should have a study or an inquiry into how it would affect our membership. I don't think that's an unreasonable position to be in. I also take on board the points that are being made in terms of time and how time is going to be relevant. And I think our inquiries might even help the white paper in establishing facts. I think they'll probably be useful rather than unhelpful. So I don't have a problem in either calling for a study or an inquiry, and also I'm more than happy to second Helen Eadie's recommendation that if we can't agree today on what we want to do, we could take it to the Parliamentary Bureau for them to have a look at our timetable to see if they can help and support, come up with a solution for us.
Okay, thank you. Can I thank everyone for their very frank exchanges there. I fear there is no consensus amongst the committee on this, so I'm going to go straight to a straight question, and the question is, should the committee undertake an inquiry into the Scottish Government's handling of the issue of EU legal advice?
Just as a relatively new member of the committee, just clarify how much time is going to be allocated under the existing proposals to deal with this inquiry.
Yeah, certainly. I think when we had the initial discussions about having the inquiry on the work programme, we don't usually set the work programme that far in advance, but we decided as a committee to do that, to make that commitment to the work programme, and there is really very little scheduled around that to allow us a maximum amount of time to take in all the aspects of Scotland's place in Europe going forward.
So we are basically able to deal with this in significant detail and depth.
I do plan to give us as maximum amount of time as possible. I think the points are really well made by both Helen and Patricia on this, that we do need to look at this. I just believe we need to do it when we get the white paper and we see their proposals.
Could you clarify for us, Convener, when we are likely to have that white paper? And also, does Patricia have any right of reply to the questions that have been made here this morning?
I think we'll go straight to the vote. I think I've given everybody sort of a fair airtime. I think
you
on your question
about the
on time scale, I believe, because I don't know much more than you do, Helen, on this one. I believe that the plan is to publish it in spring, so we will see it in spring, which will give us an opportunity to then prepare for an inquiry and set up the lines of inquiry. With, I think, the final recommendations go to Parliament in autumn next year.
So are you saying that we would start our inquiry the moment the white paper is published? Or are you saying we would not start our inquiry until perhaps September, October time of next year, leaving barely 5 months before the referendum takes place?
Wouldn't it be 5 months? Yeah, yeah. Jim.
I mean, it may be helpful if I come in here and to provide some procedural advice for the committee. I mean, as my understanding, the committee's obviously agreed to do the inquiry, and what would happen then is that the clerks would bring forward an approach paper at the time in which the white paper is published, setting out possibilities in terms of timescales, etc., witnesses for the committee to consider.
Could you clarify for us, though, in terms of that white paper, what those timescales will be, and will the inquiry only examine the bill, or will our inquiry examine questions of European Union membership? Will it also look at the euro currency issues? Will it also look at the referendum issues that the people of Scotland may wish to have about European Union membership or not, as the case might be, as it happened in Greenland?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the publication of the white paper is a matter for the government, so it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on that. And it's in terms of the content of the approach, that would be a matter for the committee to decide once that's published. So these are decisions that the committee would have to take.
Yes, but you're still not answering my question with respect, Convener. My question was, if the white paper is published in spring, will our inquiry start in spring?
Well, certainly an approach paper will be brought forward to the committee and we can decide that then. It'll be up to us to decide that then. Claire.
Clarification, because I understand that the work programme has set aside work to be done on the white paper in terms of scrutinising the proposals in the white paper. Did we actually use the word inquiry in that work programme? No, can we have that clarified? Because I think that's very important. We've not agreed to an inquiry. Yes. We've agreed to scrutiny of the white paper.
That's correct. It's in terms of the approach, so whatever that would be, whether it be an inquiry or whatever, that's a matter for the committee to decide.
Can I just question that? Because my memory was that in actual fact it was about relationships with the EU, which is not the same as looking at the bill or looking at an inquiry. It was the work title said that it would be relationships with the EU, which is not anywhere near the issues which have been raised by Patricia Ferguson this morning.
I think maybe a circulation of the official report from that agreement will maybe clarify all of those questions for us. Yeah?
It's okay. I mean, yes. I mean, the clerks will circulate the wording of what was agreed after the meeting. Yeah. There's wording which has been agreed. We're happy to circulate that.
I'm just saying the title on the document said relationships with the EU. That was precisely the wording of the title on the work programme.
I think there was some discussion and a lot of detail in that as well. So I want to get you as much information as possible on that to clarify and clear up any.
So do we have a commitment from you then, Convener, that we will, as a committee, look at this the very moment the white paper is published?
Well, I think the committee has agreed that as soon as it's published, we will have an approach paper from the clerks, and then we can decide where we want to go with it from there.
I mean, it may be helpful if I read the wording out now in terms of what's been agreed, and it says that upon publication of the Scottish Government's white paper on independence, consider approach to exploration of an independent Scotland's relations with the EU. That's the wording that's been agreed.
Okay. To relations with the EU, so I was right in what I said.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Okay, can we move straight?
It still doesn't cover issues that have been raised by Patricia's letter. But
okay, can we move straight to the question then? Should this committee undertake an inquiry into the... Sorry, Patricia?
If it's possible, I wouldn't mind responding to some of the points that have been made, if that is allowable.
Okay.
I think if I do them in reverse order, perhaps I apologise to Willie Coffey. I couldn't be here for the entire committee, but I'm also on the Referendum Bill Committee, which is meeting at the same time, so I've had to crave the convener's indulgence to pop out. But I think actually Willie Coffey in some way made my point, because the gentleman who spoke with expertise this morning at the committee obviously had a point of view, but a different point of view has been made by many other eminent people, both politicians and officials, who work in this area. And I think that is exactly the point I am making, that we actually don't know. And the more discussion and debate there can be around this issue, in my view, the more helpful it would be. And I think too that Claire Adamson also, to an extent, makes my point, because we don't actually know what will be in the white paper. We don't know what it will say about relationships with Europe or with any other organisation for that matter, because it may not be something that is in the white paper, because the white paper will be about the law surrounding the issue, not necessarily about further negotiations. So I think that actually it is very important. I have to say to both Claire Adamson and to Roderick Campbell, and I apologise to Roderick if my letter didn't make sense to him, but sometimes enthusiasm gets in the way of good structure and even good grammar, as I find to my chagrin sometimes, particularly when I read back what I've said rather than what I've written. But actually, the position of the Lord Advocate is slightly more complicated than perhaps Roderick suggested this morning, because the Lord Advocate does frequently come to Parliament to answer questions, and also comes to committee to answer questions, and indeed not that long ago came to a committee to explain what the sectarianism bill meant. So, you know, he is in a sort of hybrid position of being in part a political appointment, but also obviously we want to safeguard his independence, but he has made comment on the issue, and in fact I don't think his comment clarified anything at all. I think he added confusion to the situation, and that was one of the reasons why I've included him in my letter. However, it would of course be for the committee to decide exactly how it structured any inquiry and who it chose to take evidence from. But I think it is worth just making the point again that actually we don't know what the white paper will say in terms of the European issues, but I'm very grateful for what I think was clarification of when the white paper will emerge, which I understand now to be spring next year, which I have to say is a surprise, because that's not what's being said elsewhere.
Okay, can I ask committee members whether the committee should undertake an inquiry into Scottish Government's handling of the EU legal advice? Those in favour of that inquiry, could you raise their hand, please? The question is, should the committee undertake an inquiry into the Scottish Government's handling of the issues of EU legal advice? And those in favour of that inquiry, please raise. Okay. Those against that, please raise. Okay. Nobody here to abstain. Okay. So I think that recommendation has been defeated. Helen, I've taken a wee bit of advice from Jim on your motion about referring to Bureau, and he's going to give us all some advice on that now, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay, Jim.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the previous discussion, the committee noted that it's the decision that it had previously taken in terms of agreeing to consider the approach once the white paper is published. So the issue would be whether or not the committee wants to review the decision in the light of what Helen has said.
That's not clarified. That doesn't mean anything to me. Could you?
I think the clarification is that we need is that, you know, technically I'm correct that standing order says quite clearly, because I checked last night, that any member of any committee may request a referral to the Parliamentary Bureau for any inquiry or any piece of work that requires to be done. And given the nature of the kind of issues that are being raised arising from the future of the European Union, it would be entirely appropriate for the Parliamentary Bureau to examine whether there are a number of other committees that should be undertaking strands of work in the same way. For example, that the Standards Committee has worked in collaboration with the presiding officer undertaking work about the reform of the Scottish Parliament. There are different aspects of the Parliament who can be undertaking scrutiny of issues that are forthcoming. So what I'm saying is that this should be referred to the Parliamentary Bureau for their consideration to clarify which other committees may have an interest in this and who should be asked to undertake some strands of this work as well.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, well, I mean, fair enough. If the committee wanted to do that, then that'd be a matter for the committee to decide.
Okay, Claire.
I don't agree with Helen's position regarding this issue. Every committee has a European reporter, and I would expect that the structure in place with the European reporter would bring any areas of concern to that committee, and that committee would make their decision about what their work programme should be.
Okay. Thanks, Claire. I think obviously we haven't reach consensus on this, and I could retake the vote again, but I think it's pretty clear where we're at.
Well, no, I mean, clearly the vote that the committee just had was with regard to Patricia's specific request for the inquiry into the handling of the Scottish Government's handling of the issue. So, I mean, I think that the committee will have to make a decision with regards to Helen's specific point to refer the wider issue to the Bureau.
It's because, if I may say so, I did say formally I wish to move a motion. It was seconded by Hanzala, and my point would be that, you know, if the committee doesn't agree to this morning, this will be perceived by our nation in Scotland as a parliament controlled by your party that does not want the issues to be raised.
Right, I'm going to go straight to your vote, Helen. Helen, could you not speak over the chair, please? Could you desist from speaking over the chair?
It's another example of you, Christina, in the chair, trying to gag me once more on this issue.
Helen, I think I've given you a fair hearing this morning.
You've gagged me again, Christina.
Again, Helen.
Sorry, I mean, it might be helpful if I just offer some procedural advice in terms of this specific point. I mean, Rule 11.8.1 states that it's the convener shall determine the time at which members shall take a decision on any item of business. So it's a matter for the convener to determine when to take the vote.
Okay, so I'm going to go straight to a vote and ask members if they are content.
Chair, sorry, point of order.
Hanzala.
Thank you. I'm just looking for clarity. I'm not aware of this rule in terms of taking anything to the Parliamentary Bureau. Does that need to go via a committee, or can that go via a member themselves?
A member may refer an item to the Parliamentary Bureau. That's what the standing order said.
So we don't really need to go through a vote then? Am I right? Please, somebody guide me.
Well, maybe that's my job.
Right.
I mean, this is a matter. I mean, it's a matter for Helen. If Helen, you know, if an individual member wishes to raise something with the Bureau, of course they could do that via their business manager. The issue is whether or not the committee wants to refer this to the Bureau. And my understanding was that's what the member was asking for.
Yes, I was asking for the public to have the right to have the information that they're required to make the decisions. But if you don't want the public to have that right, that's fine.
I'm just trying to get to grips with this. So what's clear for me is there are in fact two opportunities. The first opportunity is as we've raised it at committee. So either the committee could do it. However, if the committee decides not to do it, then you as an individual will have the right to do it. Am I right in that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. If that's the case, if the motion is not for the committee to take a position on this, then we don't need a vote, and it's up to the individual member to take forward
no, I
a
have
proposal.
Moved a motion, and I would like that motion to be voted on.
Okay. So the question is for the committee to refer the inquiry or the option of an inquiry to the Bureau. Those in favour of that motion, please raise. And those against? Okay. I think that motion's been defeated. I'm going to move on because we are quickly running out of time. Can I thank Patricia Ferguson for coming to committee and sincerely say to her that when we do come to consideration of this, that we will really benefit from her experience and her input into the process. Thank you. Okay, we have agreed to take agenda item 6 in private, so if we can have the public gallery cleared, and thanks you to people for coming along today.